This episode is called Bad Blood. It was February 24th, 1991, and Jennifer Jackson was at a hospital in St. Louis, Missouri. She was in labor, and she was about to give birth to her second child. And she was doing it alone. Her boyfriend, and the father of this child, Brian Stewart, was an Army medic, and currently he was deployed to the Middle East, so he couldn't be there for the birth. Brian was heartbroken that he couldn't be there for this big moment. He was so excited to become a dad. Before leaving for this deployment, he'd given Jennifer a framed poem he had written about becoming a parent. And whenever they spoke on the phone, Brian couldn't wait to hear about Jennifer's latest ultrasound and how big the baby was getting. And through it all, Brian had just one request about the baby boy who would be born while he was overseas. He wanted Jennifer to name this child after him. Brian knew that there was a chance he could be killed in action, and so he wanted to guarantee that this baby always had a connection to their father. Just then, a huge, painful contraction brought Jennifer back into the present, and her doctor told her, "Come on, one more push, just one more push." And a few minutes later, Jennifer was holding a screaming little baby boy, Brian Jr., in her arms. 9 months later, on Christmas morning, Jennifer sat on the couch, helping baby Brian open his presents, while Brian Sr. sat next to them, sipping coffee. Jennifer looked over at him and squeezed his leg. Ever since coming home a few months ago, Brian had been this amazing father and partner. He did what he could to help with the baby, and he was extremely attentive to Jennifer's needs. He loved to hold her hand and talk about their future together. But Jennifer felt like she was still getting to know Brian. They hadn't been dating that long before she got pregnant and he went off to war. So when he sometimes got moody and walked out in a huff, Jennifer didn't really know what to think. But with Brian's charming smile and good looks, Jennifer could never stay mad at him for very long. And after all, he did always come back, which was more than she could say for her previous boyfriends. The father of her first child was hardly in her young daughter's life at all. But on this particular morning, their first Christmas together as a family, Brian began acting pretty strangely. When Jennifer handed him a present for the baby and asked Brian Sr. to help open it, Brian Sr. refused. And then a dark expression came over his face and he got up off the couch and began pacing. Jennifer had no idea what he was doing, and at first she thought, maybe he's having a flashback from his time in the Middle East. And so she asked Brian, hey, are you okay? But Brian just kept on pacing. And then at some point, Brian came to a stop, he took a deep breath and looked Jennifer in the eye and said, "I don't think I'm Brian Jr.'s father." Jennifer was totally stunned. She asked Brian where this was coming from. Then she held the baby up and asked how could he believe this child was anyone else's but his. The baby looked just like Brian Sr. But Brian Sr. refused to listen, and he ultimately stormed out of the room, shouting that he knew the truth and was not going to raise another man's child. Jennifer didn't know what to do. She wanted to follow after him to their bedroom and get him to calm down, but Brian seemed so angry, she didn't know how he'd react if she just kept on insisting the baby really was his. So she just hung back and tried her best to comfort Brian Jr., while Brian Sr. packed a bag and left the house. About 2 months later, Jennifer was at home, balancing her son on her hip while she tried to cook some lunch for him and his sister. Adjusting to life as a single mother had been very challenging for Jennifer, and she wasn't getting much help from anybody else in her family either. Jennifer's sister was around a lot, but she was also a drug addict. And so a lot of the times when Jennifer's sister came over, she'd come over with a friend or two and they were high on heroin. Sometimes Jennifer even caught her sister and her friends injecting drugs in her house. Jennifer hated all the substance abuse around her kids, but at the same time, she just didn't have the heart to stop her sister from coming around because it meant a lot to her sister to visit the kids. Every now and again, Jennifer would try calling Brian for help, but whenever he actually answered the phone, he would just yell at her about how Brian Jr. was not his son. Jennifer did her best not to let it bother her and just focused on trying to raise her kids as best as she could. But as Jennifer cooked up some mac and cheese, she noticed little Brian's breathing suddenly sounded different. He was wheezing and it seemed like he was having a hard time catching his breath. Jennifer had no idea what was going on, but just from the looks of it, this didn't look like a common cold or something else that was easy to explain. This looked pretty serious. And so as her little boy continued to struggle to breathe, Jennifer just picked up her phone, called her mom, and told her to meet her at the hospital. Then Jennifer bundled up her kids and drove to the nearest emergency room. A few hours later, Jennifer was sitting beside little Brian's crib at St. Joseph's West Hospital in Lake St. Louis. The baby was hooked up to an IV, as well as all sorts of monitors that measured his vitals. Thankfully, though, he was now breathing normally. Little Brian's pediatrician, Dr. Linda Steele Green, was treating the baby for pneumonia and asthma, a chronic disease that can make breathing difficult. The doctor explained that Brian Jr. had an asthma attack, but she had given him some treatments to stabilize him. For Jennifer, this diagnosis was both relieving and kind of daunting. She now knew baby Brian would be okay, but asthma was a condition that her son would have to live with for the rest of his life. Jennifer thought about the baby's father, Brian Sr. Even though he had not been involved in his son's life since he moved out, Jennifer figured she should let him know what was going on. So she used the hospital room's phone to call another hospital where Brian Sr. worked as a lab tech. A few moments later, one of Brian's colleagues answered the call, and Jennifer told them to please find Brian Stewart because his son was at St. Joseph's Hospital. But the person on the other end sounded confused. They asked Jennifer if she was maybe looking for a different Brian Stewart, because the Brian Stewart that worked there had never said anything about having a son. Jennifer almost slammed the phone down in anger. She knew Brian was in denial about being little Brian's father, but this was just disgraceful. Trying to stay calm, she assured the colleague that, oh yes, she had the right Brian Stewart and to please relay this message as soon as possible. After Jennifer hung up, she did her best to put Brian Sr. out of her mind. For now, the only thing that mattered was her baby boy getting better. The next morning, Jennifer was leaning over the edge of little Brian's hospital crib as he slept, holding his hand. The breathing treatments were working, and once the baby woke up, the doctor said he was well enough to go home. Jennifer got up to go pack some things when she suddenly heard someone walk through the door. She turned around, and much to her surprise, Brian Sr. was standing there with his white lab coat folded over his arm. He said he was there to see the baby. Jennifer was definitely surprised to see him. She didn't really know how she felt about it, but at the same time, she was grateful that her ex-boyfriend obviously cared enough about their son that he was here now to visit him in the hospital. Brian Sr. placed his lab coat down on a chair and then walked over to Jennifer and gently took Brian Jr. from her arms. Brian Sr. smiled at the baby and then said to Jennifer that she should take a break and grab a snack. Jennifer smiled and took him up on the offer and headed down to the hospital cafeteria. About 20 minutes later, Jennifer was done with her break, so she stepped back into the elevator and rode it upstairs towards the pediatric floor. When the elevator doors opened, Jennifer heard the unmistakable sound of her own child screaming, and so Jennifer took off running towards her son's room. Once she got there, she found Brian Sr. sitting in a rocking chair, looking terrified and very confused. He was holding little Brian in his arms. The baby was sobbing. Jennifer tried to run over and grab her son, but before she could, nurses rushed in and put little Brian back in his bed and began taking his vitals. They said his blood pressure and pulse were much higher than normal. A moment later, little Brian's pediatrician, Dr. Steele Green, came in to examine him. Jennifer stood off to the side, biting her nails nervously. Finally, after doing the exam, Dr. Steele Green told Jennifer that she couldn't explain why little Brian's vital signs were so off. He was stable now, but whatever had just happened definitely was not an asthma attack. So a decision was made to keep Brian Jr. in the hospital for further observation instead of discharging him like they'd planned. Jennifer turned to Brian Sr. and asked him what happened while she was gone. He just shrugged. He said everything was going fine, Brian Jr. seemed perfectly happy, and then all of a sudden, he was just crying his lungs out. Jennifer asked Brian Sr. if he wanted to stay a bit longer, but he just shook his head and said no. He said he had a lot to do and that he wouldn't be much help here anyway. Then he picked up his lab coat, and after waving goodbye to the baby, he left Jennifer alone to comfort their son. Jennifer stayed in the room with Brian Jr. for the next few days as doctors continued to monitor his progress. Finally, Dr. Steele Green said it was safe for them to go home now. As Jennifer strapped her son into a stroller, the pediatrician told her to look out for asthma symptoms. But beyond that, her baby boy should be just fine. 4 years later, in the spring of 1996, Jennifer ran a bath for Brian Jr., who was now 5 years old. After the frightening hospital visit when he was an infant, Brian's childhood had actually gone as normally as it could. But he hadn't actually seen his father again since that hospital visit. Brian Sr. continued to deny that he was the child's father, and he very clearly did not want to be involved in this baby's life anyway. Jennifer thought ultimately it was for the best. It was Brian Sr.'s loss. Jennifer and Brian Jr. were getting along just fine by themselves. Once the bath was ready, Jennifer squirted some soap on a washcloth and began to get Brian cleaned up. But as she scrubbed him, she noticed something strange. They'd gone to the park earlier, and Brian had gotten a couple of scrapes and cuts like all kids do, but they looked really red and swollen. And some fresh mosquito bites that he had gotten at the park looked huge and inflamed. It was like his body was not properly healing itself. Jennifer helped her son out of the bath and put some bandages on his wounds, and as they walked to his room to get ready for bed, Jennifer noticed Brian Jr. was now walking strangely, like he was having trouble keeping his balance. Jennifer held her son's hands to try to help him walk, and she noticed his palms felt clammy. So Jennifer took his temperature, and she was shocked to see the thermometer read 105 degrees. Even though Brian Jr. had just been in the bath, Jennifer knew Brian's body temperature should not be this high. This was a potentially lethal fever, and he needed medical attention right away. Once they arrived at the hospital, little Brian was taken straight to the pediatric intensive care unit. Jennifer did her best not to panic, as a team of doctors, including Dr. Steele Green, hooked up Brian Jr. to a bunch of monitors and stuck needles in his arms for IVs and blood tests. It was nerve-wracking, but Jennifer was glad that Dr. Steele Green was there. The two women had become friends after Brian Jr.'s hospital stay when he was a baby, and Dr. Steele Green had continued to see the boy for regular pediatric appointments. Jennifer was very confident that Dr. Steele Green would be able to help her son. By the end of the day, little Brian had been stabilized, but the doctors still didn't know what was wrong with him. Dr. Steele Green promised Jennifer she would run every test she could, and hopefully they would have an answer in the morning. That night, Jennifer lay awake on the couch inside of little Brian's hospital room, listening to her son's heart monitor beeping. Jennifer had been trying to stay optimistic, but it was now clear that little Brian was seriously ill. But still, Jennifer knew that Dr. Steele Green would do everything she could to figure out what was wrong. Just as Jennifer was beginning to fall asleep, little Brian suddenly shot up in bed, crying and screaming for his mother. Jennifer rushed over to him and tried to calm him down, but he just kept on sobbing and begging his mother not to let him die. Jennifer promised her son that he'd be okay. The doctors would figure out what was wrong with him, and they would fix it. She said this over and over again and held her son close until finally little Brian did drift back to sleep. A few days later, Jennifer sat beside little Brian's hospital bed, gripping his hand as he slept. Ever since he'd been admitted, Jennifer had barely left her son's side. Little Brian was in extremely bad shape, and Jennifer didn't want to be away from him in case something really bad happened. Over the past few days, little Brian had grown weaker and weaker as his organs began to shut down one by one. His skin had grown jaundiced and yellow because his liver and spleen were not working properly, his ears were infected, and his digestive system had almost entirely shut down. And the doctors really had no idea why any of this was happening. They had tested little Brian for everything they could think of, even diseases that had been largely eradicated or only existed in other countries. Everything had come back negative. As Jennifer went down her mental checklist of all little Brian's symptoms, trying to come up with some explanation that kind of made sense, she heard a knock at the door. Dr. Steele Green opened it up and stood in the doorway with a very somber look on her face. She walked in and took a seat in a chair next to Jennifer. Jennifer could see tears forming in the doctor's eyes, and a pit began to form in Jennifer's stomach. She knew that whatever news Dr. Steele Green had, it would not be good. In a quiet voice, Dr. Steele Green told Jennifer they had finally figured out what was wrong with little Brian. It was something so unlikely, she would have probably never figured it out on her own. The only reason she'd even thought to test for it was because the possibility came to her in a nightmare. As she slept, a series of frightening images came into her mind. She saw blood, then she saw needles and test tubes, then she heard the squeak of a rocking chair and the sound of a baby crying. Then she was wide awake, sitting upright in her bed, finally having an idea of what might be wrong with little Brian. Normally, she wouldn't follow her dreams for medical advice, but Dr. Steele Green had been out of ideas, and she was willing to try anything at this point. So they had gone ahead and tested Brian for this really specific, terrible disease, and it would turn out the doctor's nightmare diagnosis was correct. Brian tested positive. Now there was no more sugarcoating. Little Brian didn't have long to live. because he'd just tested positive for the HIV virus and it had turned into full-blown AIDS at a time when there was basically no treatments for the disease. HIV can prevent the body from fighting off even the slightest infection. The disease that the virus causes is called AIDS, and 30 years ago, it was an absolute death sentence. Dr. Steele Green estimated Brian had maybe 5 months left to live. Jennifer was absolutely speechless. Panic raced through her mind as she wondered how this could have happened. Jennifer didn't know much about HIV, but from what she did know, you got it from having sex with someone who had HIV, or you got it from sharing contaminated needles. But of course, Brian was doing neither of those things because he was 5 years old. But then Jennifer's mind went to a dark place. Her thoughts turned to her sister, who was a heroin addict, who still sometimes used drugs in their house. Jennifer had done her best to keep Brian away from her sister when she was doing that, but she wondered if somehow maybe he'd gotten poked with an HIV-infected needle when she wasn't paying attention. Or, much, much worse, maybe a stranger who was infected with HIV had done the unspeakable and sexually abused her son. Jennifer looked over at her son and just began to cry. Her children were absolutely everything to her. And so for now, Jennifer knew she had to focus on just finding a way to keep her son alive. So she turned to Dr. Steele Green and told her that she was willing to do whatever it took to help Brian. 2 years later, Jennifer stood in her kitchen helping her son, Brian Jr., wiggle into a special backpack. Brian was miraculously still alive, but just barely. This special backpack he was wearing was connected to a feeding tube that led into little Brian's stomach. He needed a liquid diet to survive because he basically always vomited if he ate solid food. But both Jennifer and Brian agreed that it was a worthy trade-off because he'd beaten all expectations and lived long past the 5 months his doctors had estimated. But it wasn't easy to get by. Because Brian required so much help every single day, Jennifer had been forced to quit her job. And because her ex-boyfriend, Brian Sr., still wouldn't send child support payments, Jennifer and her kids had to live off of food stamps and other welfare programs. And just from a medical perspective, it took a lot of work for Brian just to make it through each day. After getting his backpack secured, Jennifer walked over to the cabinet and pulled out a massive medication tray. She carefully doled out 23 different pills for Brian to take. Once Brian had taken all of his medications, Jennifer took him by the hand and they went outside to wait for the school bus. Because there was still so much fear around AIDS, little Brian was not allowed to ride on the standard school bus with most of the other kids. Instead, he had to ride on another bus for children with special needs. Jennifer's heart broke just thinking about the bullying Brian had to endure at school. Bullies called him all sorts of names, and they mocked him for the bulky hearing aids he now had to wear all the time after losing 80% of his hearing. But through it all, Brian remained relentlessly optimistic. Jennifer was so proud of his ability to remain positive despite all the suffering he'd endured, and so Jennifer did her best to not let her own fears and her own anxieties get in the way of her son's childhood. Now, just keeping her son alive basically consumed all of Jennifer's waking hours. But she also had one other major concern about her son, figuring out how he'd actually been infected with the HIV virus in the first place. A few minutes later, the bus pulled up in front of their house. Jennifer hugged her son goodbye, and then he climbed on board the bus and the bus took off, and then Jennifer went back inside her home. After she got dressed, she called Detective Kevin Wilson down at the St. Charles County Sheriff's Office. For the past 2 years, Detective Wilson had worked tirelessly to try to figure out how Brian had gotten HIV. The detective had tested the blood of at least 30 people who had spent time with Brian Jr., including Jennifer's sister and her friends, but none of them had been HIV positive, so this very likely ruled out transmission from drugs. The detective had also found no indication that little Brian had ever been sexually abused by anyone, so it was highly unlikely he got HIV that way either. But there was one lead that Detective Wilson was still working on, and that was what Jennifer was calling him about today. Detective Wilson assured her that he was close to cracking the case, but there were still some loose ends to tie up. This was a delicate situation, and he had to be absolutely sure he was right before he made his move. Before they hung up, Detective Wilson promised Jennifer that little Brian would get the justice he deserved. A few months later, in December of 1998, Jennifer sat down in the witness stand at the front of a St. Louis County courtroom. Her hands shook as she looked to her right at the judge. Right out in front of her, she saw there were news reporters, jury members, and at the defendant's table, her ex-boyfriend, Brian Stewart. He stared at her with cold, hateful eyes. Jennifer swore to tell the truth, and then took a deep breath. Speaking into a small microphone, she explained that she broke up with Brian Sr. in 1991. She said they fought bitterly over child support payments, and at one point, Brian even threatened her. Brian insisted that Brian Jr. was not his son, and Jennifer should stop asking him to give her money because, after all, Brian Jr. wouldn't even live past the age of 5. Jennifer testified that way back when little Brian was first treated for asthma, his father showed up at the hospital totally unannounced and convinced her to leave the room to go on a break. And when she came back from that break, their son was screaming. Brian Sr. had left quickly, and that was the last time he ever saw his son. Little Brian seemed okay for the next 4 years until he suddenly developed confusing and terrifying medical problems. Jennifer's voice broke as she recounted all the painful memories. The prosecuting attorney thanked her, and she stepped down from the witness stand. Then the attorney turned to the jury and explained that the answer to this mystery could be found in one place: Brian Sr.'s job. Brian Sr. worked as a hospital lab technician who was responsible for drawing blood from patients. He had access to tons of blood samples, including blood from people who are sick with infectious diseases. Brian Sr.'s work was the missing puzzle piece. With it, the prosecution could explain exactly what happened to little Brian. It went like this. Brian Stewart was an abusive boyfriend who never wanted to be a father, even though he pretended to be very enthusiastic at first. Once he moved out, he was angry over child support payments, so he hatched a plan to make them go away. On the day that 11-month-old little Brian Jr. was supposed to leave the hospital, Brian Sr. showed up carrying his lab coat. Inside his coat pocket was a vial of blood he'd stolen from the phlebotomy lab where he worked. He told Jennifer to go take a break and he would watch the baby, and then while she was gone, he used a tiny butterfly needle to inject his infant son with that contaminated blood, hoping it would eventually kill the baby. That blood came from a patient who was obviously HIV positive. So for the next 4 years, little Brian lived with the HIV virus in his body until it transformed into full-blown AIDS. And by the time the doctors figured out what was happening, the disease had already progressed, seemingly beyond hope. Ultimately, Brian Sr. would be sentenced to life in prison. The story of what he'd done to his own baby son made international news. People were absolutely horrified, but they were also inspired by Brian Jr.'s resilience. In the years following the trial, Brian Jr. continued beating the odds. He made it through elementary and middle school. At 13, he began to find comfort in Christianity, which he said allowed him to forgive his father. Incredibly, Brian Jr. is still alive today. His diagnosis seemed like a death sentence in 1996, but with new scientific advancements, today, AIDS is actually a fairly treatable disease. Brian Jr. now works as a motivational speaker, and he runs a nonprofit called Hope is Vital that aims to reduce discrimination against those living with HIV and AIDS.
In 1909, Ioana Constantinescu was a 27-year-old woman living in the Romanian city of Timișoara. Ioana was a devout practitioner of Zoroastrianism, which is one of the world's oldest organized religions that began in ancient Persia and is now practiced primarily in East Asia. In the city that Ioana was living in, it was majority Christian, and they looked at Zoroastrians as witches. As such, Ioana was persecuted and ostracized primarily by these two Christian ministers that spread a rumor that she was drinking the blood of local children and that she worshipped Satan. That rumor would spread and grow to the point where everybody knew Ioana as like the singular witch of all the Zoroastrians in the city, and it ultimately incited this angry Christian mob to storm her house on October 21st, 1909, and rip her into the streets and savagely beat her to within an inch of her life. She would survive this lynching, and she would be taken to a hospital where she'd be treated for severe blunt force injuries and lacerations. But after 2 days of being in the hospital, when she had not made a full recovery at all, she checked herself out and headed home. The next day, Luana was found dead in her apartment, and her family and friends initially believed that she had died as a result of the injuries she had sustained from the angry mob, and that perhaps she had checked herself out of the hospital too soon, and untreated, that's why she must have passed away early. But when the authorities arrived at her house and began looking at the scene, it did not look like she had died as a result of those injuries. It looked more like some sort of ritual suicide. She was laying on this sofa with her arms over her chest. Next to the sofa was an altar that was adorned with strange occult symbols and ritual herbs and effigies, and on the altar was this goblet with deep, dark red stains on the inside. When they looked at Luana, even though she was fully dressed, underneath her sleeves were all these cuts on her arms, and there were cuts on her legs as well. After her autopsy, the medical examiner said she had died from a combination of blood loss and internal shock from ingesting massive quantities of blood that triggered cardiac arrest. Luana had been draining her own blood into the sacramental goblet, drinking it, and then doing it over and over again until she died. Locals believed that that was not just a ritual suicide, but rather she was placing a curse on her enemies. Almost immediately following her death, those two Christian ministers that had spread those rumors about her that led to the mob coming and attacking her, they both died of an extremely rare blood-borne illness. And then immediately following their demise, the two primary vigilantes that actually organized that mob that would attack Luana, they both died. One was hit by a falling tree and another died in a fire. And according to more recent accounts, Luana's curse didn't end with the death of her tormentors. There have been dozens of reports of people after seeing an image, which is of Luana after she was discovered by authorities in her home, that they will have bouts of extreme sleep paralysis. These are people that have never had sleep paralysis before, that this picture somehow induces sleep paralysis in them, like they're cursed by Luana.
The next and final story of today's episode is called The Witching Hour. Just before midnight on August 22nd, 2005, 38-year-old Rick Eck knocked on the front door of an apartment in the tiny Midwestern farm town of Claremont, Illinois. As Rick waited for the door to open, he could barely stand still because he was so excited about what he was going to be doing that night. Finally, the door swung open, and Rick saw right in front of him this very skinny and gaunt-looking woman with dark hair and dark eyes staring back at him. Her name was Irenia Kottner, and she was 34 years old, and by day, she worked at Walmart, but at night, she became the real version of herself. She was a witch who actually led a group of witches known as a coven that Rick was a part of. Without saying anything, Irenia motioned for Rick to follow her into her apartment, and then Irenia turned and began walking away. And Rick, before stepping over the threshold, he paused for a moment and just turned to the guy he had brought with him, a tall, muscular man named David Lindner, and Rick, he just kind of nodded at David, and David nodded back, and then the two of them walked inside. As Rick and David followed Irenia into her apartment, Rick still could barely contain his excitement. He had only joined this coven recently, about a year and a half ago, and so witchcraft, which is something they were going to be doing that night, was kind of new to him, but it was very exciting. Rick had been inspired to become a witch and join this coven after watching the Harry Potter movies, and so he was hopeful that tonight would go something like Harry Potter. And Rick knew David, the guy he had brought along, was this very powerful warlock, which is a male witch, and so he figured, if David's here, this is bound to go to plan. Rick just hoped he'd be able to keep up with David, or at least play some sort of meaningful support role. Irenia eventually led Rick and David down this dark hallway to this small living room where in the middle of the floor was a ring of lit candles. And as soon as Rick and David stepped into the room with Irenia, they were hit with this powerful smell of incense that had been burning in the room,
and also there was all this smoke hovering in the air from the various things that Irenia had been burning in preparation for tonight's event. Rick, David, and Irenia walked quietly into the middle of this circle of candles, and they sat down cross-legged in a circle facing each other, and then they got ready to begin. Life in the town of Claremont was normally very quiet and peaceful. I mean, this is a town that literally has more cornfields than people, and Claremont was over 100 miles away from the nearest city. But beneath the calm exterior, Claremont had a dark side. Amongst the 200 or so residents of Claremont were several very dark witches. Not this coven, not Irenia, Rick, and David. They were the good guys. The dark witches, they were kind of out and about in this town and doing bad things, like practicing evil magic and evil witchcraft. And so this coven, led by Irenia, was actually in place to try to combat these evil witches in their midst. And tonight, Rick, David, and Irenia were going to attempt to perform their most ambitious and important magic yet. The coven was going to attempt to break a powerful hex, which is kind of like a curse. And this hex was cast by a person who might very well be the worst of all the dark witches in Claremont, a 16-year-old girl named Lindsay Cassinger. As Rick sat cross-legged in the middle of the circle, he found himself staring at the two slightly bigger candles that sat in the dead center of the circle, that were basically right between Rick, David, and Irenia. And David, as he stared at these two candles, he saw etched in each of the candles' bodies were words. On one candle, it said Lindsay, and on the other candle, it was etched baby. Because it would turn out this very evil dark witch, Lindsay, was pregnant. And so instead of having to combat one dark soul, the coven would have to combat two, because Lindsay and her baby were kind of intertwined. Now, before this night, the coven had attempted several times to try to break this hex that Lindsay had cast. And the coven believed initially this hex was actually cast directly at Irenia, because Irenia was suffering from things like depression and anxiety and not finding love. And so, of course, that had to be a product of this curse. And as the coven had continued to try and fail at breaking this hex, the hex had only become more powerful and begun to spread. From Irenia to other witches in this coven who actually were not present this particular night, including a 20-year-old woman who began complaining of depression and ever-worsening headaches, which of course had to be because of this hex. And so that was why, on this night, the coven had decided to really beef up their attack on this hex, and so that was why Rick had gone out and brought in David, the experienced warlock from St. Louis, Missouri, who claimed he had broken a hex before, and he could do it again for them. As Rick, Irenia, and Dave all sat in the circle, they looked at each other, and then they began chanting in unison to bring out the dead, to join them in the living room right now. And as they began this chant, Rick found himself intensely staring at those two candles with Lindsay and baby on them, and as he stared at the flames dancing across the top of them, Rick started to feel like he was kind of drifting off into a trance-like state. And he knew that based on his prior teachings from Irenia, the leader of this coven, that this must be what it feels like when the spirit world opens up, which means the dead really were coming into the room. And then, as Rick is kind of dealing with this trance-like state, he heard Irenia begin to talk, but it wasn't her normal voice. It was the slow and deep-sounding voice, almost like something had inhabited her body and taken it over and was now speaking through her mouth. And Irenia, in this kind of slow and strange voice, she would tell Rick and David that the curse is still growing. And then she would say something that totally caught Rick by surprise. She said, again in that slow, strange voice, that the hex now was also on Rick and his entire family, and if they didn't break this hex immediately, Rick and his family would all perish. And when Rick heard this, he's still in this trance-like state, but his heart began racing because he didn't know this hex could potentially affect his loved ones. And so this was a really big deal. They needed to end this hex tonight. Rick listened intently as Irenia began to say in this strange voice what their plan was for that night to break this hex. Basically, Rick and David were going to perform a sacred ritual, and Irenia, she began to say to the spirits in the room that Rick and David, they were ready, but they needed help. And so after she said this, she went quiet, and so too did Rick and David, and they're all just sitting there kind of waiting for something to happen. And then after about a minute of just total silence, Irenia began to speak again, still in this strange, slow, bizarre voice, but Rick and David knew now it was a different voice coming out of her. Now Irenia was speaking on behalf of the spirit world that was in the room with them. And Irenia, she would say in this voice, "I grant you 5 demons to help you on your quest to break this hex." And then after saying this, Irenia, she opened her eyes and she looked kind of confused for a moment, and then she kind of got her bearings and she looked at David and Rick and she told them now in her normal voice that they had to perform this sacred ritual before the 2 candles in the middle with Lindsay and Baby etched on them burned out. And so basically, Rick and David, they needed to get this done tonight. Then Irenia handed David a sacred tool that would be used that night in this sacred ritual that David and Rick were going to complete. And then Rick and David, they would stand up to leave, and before they left, Irenia would give them the typical witch send-off, which was, "Blessed be." And then Rick and David, they nodded their heads, they turned and walked out of the apartment, and as soon as they were out into the night, Rick could have sworn he saw dark shadows moving around all over the place. And he knew right then and there that he and David would be safe that night, because clearly the shadows moving around had to be those 5 demons that Irenia had called forth from the spirit world to protect them this night. And so feeling very safe and empowered, Rick and David went straight into Rick's car. Rick turned it on and pulled away from the curb and began heading towards their destination. A few miles away, at the house where the 16-year-old evil witch, Lindsay Kassinger, lived, a 20-year-old Army private named Joshua Bennett was sitting at the kitchen table in Lindsay's house, eating chicken wings and just kind of enjoying his night. Josh didn't know Lindsay very well, but he wasn't at her house to see Lindsay. He was at her house to see his own mother. And Josh and his mother had a lot of catching up to do. She had abandoned him and his father when he was young, and so Josh's dad had raised him, and then when Josh was old enough, he had joined the military, and now he was about to deploy to the Middle East to go to war. But unexpectedly, Josh's father had died, and so Josh had come back to Illinois for the funeral, and it was at the funeral where he saw his mother. She was in attendance as well, and, even though he was upset with his mother for abandoning him, he felt like, I want to reconnect with her. And so he'd gone over and he'd given her a hug, and his mother had been so touched that she had asked Josh to come by her house in Claremont, Illinois, where she lived with her boyfriend, because she really wanted some alone time to actually hear about Josh's life and kind of, get back together again. And so, of course, Josh had said yes, and so here he was at this house in Claremont. Now, Josh had arrived at this house a little bit earlier, and he was surprised to discover that it was not just his mother and her boyfriend living there, but also his mother's boyfriend's son, whose name was Jackie, was also living there, along with his pregnant girlfriend, the evil witch, Lindsay Kassinger. But Josh didn't really mind that there was extra people. It was just maybe a little bit confusing that this was kind of a big roommate situation. But it seemed like Jackie and his girlfriend Lindsay were very nice people, and they quickly went downstairs to the apartment in the basement and kind of just stayed out of the way so Josh and his mother could catch up. And so after Josh finished eating his wings, his mother came into the kitchen and the two of them chatted for hours. And then finally, at about midnight that night, Josh decided to go to bed. So he said goodnight to his mom. He retreated to the bedroom and he laid in bed. But he couldn't really sleep right away because he had a lot going on in his life. I mean, he had just lost his dad a couple of weeks ago. And then at the same time, he had reconnected with his estranged mother, and he's about to deploy to Iraq, to a war zone. And, he felt ready for that. But at the same time, he was kind of apprehensive. It's about to happen. I hope I'll be able to do my job. And so with all these kind of intense thoughts swirling around his head, he just kind of laid there and didn't really expect to sleep anytime soon. But eventually, Josh did fall asleep. However, it felt like he had only been asleep for a couple of minutes when he was abruptly woken up by the sound of barking coming out from the kitchen. Jackie's dog was going crazy. And so Josh grabbed his phone and he checked the time and saw it was 3 a.m. And so instead of going out there and dealing with this dog, he just thought, you know what, it's going to stop eventually. And so Josh grabbed his pillow and he put it over his head and tried to muffle the sounds so he could fall back asleep. But it didn't work. The dog just kept on barking. And then when Josh took the pillow off his head and kind of sat up wondering what he should do about this dog situation, he heard the sound of a man's voice, a stranger's voice, saying, "I bring you forth from the dark." And then after Josh heard this, he heard the sound of a woman screaming, and it sounded like his mom. And so acting on instinct, Josh leapt from his bed, he ran out of the room, and he goes into the kitchen, and he sees the dog is jumping and barking and going mad, and his mom is screaming, and there's this guy grabbing her, kind of grappling with her, who's wearing black gloves and a ski mask, and there's another guy next to him with the same getup. It's absolute chaos. But before Josh could run over and save his mother, suddenly his chest felt like it was on fire, and then he went blind, and his eyes had this burning pain in them, and then he couldn't breathe, and he was stumbling backwards, barely able to stand. Minutes later, Rick, who was one of the witches from the coven, bolted out of the front door of Lindsay's house where all this chaos was happening, and he just took off running across the street directly into a cornfield. And as he ran, he felt this throbbing pain in his leg, and he could feel blood pooling in his shoe. Rick ran until he couldn't run any farther, and then he collapsed onto the ground, and then he began thinking about what an absolute disaster it had been inside of the evil witch's house. Not only had they failed to break the hex cast by Lindsay, but also Rick was concerned that David, his partner, who was still at the house, was dead. And Rick, he began looking around wildly, hoping all those demons that were sent to help them from the spirit world, he was hoping they'd be nearby and they'd know what to do. But Rick looked around and there was no one. So Rick thought for a second, oh my gosh, Lindsay's hex must be stronger than any of us realize. You know, we have to do something now. We have to end this before me and my family get killed too. And so Rick pulled out his phone and he called Irenia, the leader of the coven, to get her advice about what they should do next. But Irenia didn't respond to what Rick was saying the way he expected her to. Instead, she seemed very cold and almost enraged at what he was saying. And then before Rick could kind of figure out what was going on with Irenia, he heard off in the distance the sound of sirens making their way to the evil witch's house. Over the next few days, police detectives would speak to everyone inside of Irenia's coven, as well as everyone who knew both Irenia and Lindsay. And slowly but surely, the police would put together what actually happened inside of Lindsay, the evil witch's house, in the early morning hours of August 23rd, 2005. At about 3 a.m. on August 23rd, 2005, Rick and David pulled up onto Lindsay's street and they parked their car a little ways away from Lindsay's house. And then after parking, Rick and David donned their ski masks and their gloves. And then after looking at each other and nodding, they hopped out and began walking towards Lindsay's house. Their plan was to sneak in through one of Lindsay's windows and confront Lindsay the evil witch directly and break the hex by performing a sacred ritual. And then after this ritual was over, they had a second ritual they would need to perform that would send Lindsay's evil soul through the gates of hell. And to do that, they needed the help of the 5 demons that had been sent along by Irenia from the spirit world. Now, Rick and David felt like this was a great plan. However, as soon as they got to Lindsay's house and David actually began trying to climb into one of the windows, everything fell apart. First, the dog began to bark inside of Lindsay's house, and that alerted Josh's mother, who came into the kitchen and sees the dog and sees David falling through the window. And Rick, who didn't really know what was happening inside the house, he just climbed through the window after David, and when he stood up in the kitchen, he realized it was too late. They were totally caught. And so Rick, not really knowing what to do, he's seeing all this yelling and chaos happening. He looks over at David, and he sees David grab something from his belt, and he pulls it out. and it was the tool that Irenia had given them when they left her apartment to go carry out the sacred ritual. This tool was part of that sacred ritual, and it was a long, sharp knife. And what they were going to do is stab the evil witch, Lindsay Kassinger, to death with it. That was how they were going to break the hex. And then after they killed Lindsay, they were going to perform this weird ritual with her clothing that would send her soul through the gates of hell. Now, Rick did understand that this was the plan. They were going to murder Lindsay, but perhaps he didn't really know how serious David was about carrying it out, or the fact that David was not really a warlock as much as he was a violent criminal who had bragged to Irenia about previously murdering someone who had cast a separate hex. And so by killing this person, that was how David had broken the hex previously. Also, Rick may not have known that David had been instructed by Irenia to not let anything stand in their way to break this hex, to carry out this sacred ritual on Lindsay. And so Rick just watched as David raised the knife and began stabbing Josh's mother over and over again in the chest while screaming, "I bring you forth from the dark." And it was at this point that Josh, the army private who heard all this happening, came charging out in his underwear into the kitchen, and Rick watched as David went from stabbing Josh's mother to turning and immediately stabbing Josh directly in the chest. And Rick, at this point, he just jumped right in on it and pulled out his pepper spray and sprayed Josh in the eyes. And so that was why Josh felt the burning sensation and then went blind and couldn't breathe and fell to the ground. And so now it is absolutely chaos inside of this kitchen, and the actual target of David and Rick's, Lindsay, the evil witch, she managed to run out of the house and run to a nearby neighbor's house to get help. Meanwhile, the evil witch's boyfriend, Jackie, he comes upstairs carrying a shotgun. And at this point, Josh is on the ground, clearly dying from the stab wound to his chest. His mother as well is struggling on the ground. And David is going totally nuts, saying all these strange things and whipping his knife around. And Rick is just totally panicking and doesn't know what to do. And so when Jackie ran at Rick with this shotgun, Rick pulled out his own knife and attempted to stab Jackie, but somehow missed Jackie and stabbed himself in the leg. And so that was why his leg was throbbing and bleeding, because he had stabbed himself. And then after Rick had stabbed himself, Jackie just walked over and Spartan kicked Rick down the stairs into the basement. And then Jackie turned his attention from Rick to David, who was still just going nuts with this knife and being a total maniac. And Jackie just walked over to David, and David, he sees the shotgun coming over to him, and he tries to move the barrel out of the way, but then somehow only manages to point the gun directly at his own stomach, at which point Jackie just fired a slug directly into David's gut. And it was at this moment, as David is crumpling to the ground with this horrible stomach wound, that the neighbor that Lindsay, the evil witch, had gone to go get, had come to the house. They went inside, and they found a scene of absolute carnage. And before the neighbor could even do anything, Rick, who had stabbed himself in the leg and been kicked down into the basement, had scrambled up the steps and just run right past all the bodies on the ground, past the neighbor who didn't even do anything, outside, and Rick just kept on running out into that cornfield. And so at this point, the neighbor didn't even try to figure out what happened. He just called 911. But it was already too late for Josh, the army private, who was only at this house to reconnect with his estranged mother before he deployed to Iraq, and here he was, dead on the ground from this totally bizarre attack. It would turn out Rick, David, and really the entire coven of witches that fell under Irenia had been totally duped. They all fully believed that Lindsay was in fact an evil witch who had cast this hex on Irenia, which was spreading to all the other members of the coven. But in reality, Irenia, the leader of this coven, she didn't believe there was a hex. That had nothing to do with any of this. The whole coven thing was totally made up. She was just jealous that Lindsay was dating Jackie. Irenia had previously dated Jackie and they had broken up, and Irenia still wanted to get back together, but Jackie didn't. And so now that Jackie was with Lindsay, Irenia just couldn't handle it. And so, naturally, Irenia had constructed this whole thing about Lindsay being one of the dark witches in Claremont, Illinois, and she's cast this hex, and now you, my witches in this coven, you need to go and kill her. But, of course, Lindsay did not end up getting killed, and instead, it was the totally innocent person, Josh, the army private, who had nothing to do with any of this, who got killed. In addition to Josh dying, David, the warlock from St. Louis, he died from the shotgun blast to his stomach, and then Josh's mother, who had been stabbed repeatedly by David, she would actually survive her attack. Irenia would ultimately be found guilty of first-degree murder, and she would be sentenced to 57 years in prison. Rick pleaded guilty to murder as well, and he was sentenced to 20 years, and a third member of the coven, who was not present for the attack, but who after the fact helped cover it up, they were sentenced to 32 years in prison.
A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen Podcast. If you enjoyed today's stories and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. This podcast, the MrBallen Podcast, and also MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, Wartime Stories, Run Fool, and Redacted. Just search for Ballen Studios wherever you get your podcasts to find all of these shows. To watch hundreds more stories just like the ones you